wonderful to welcome everyone this evening to this seminar, and also gives Archdeacon Phil and I an opportunity to say a huge thank you to all of you Churchwardens for all that you're doing, for all your work and commitment. And it's just lovely to be with you tonight. I'm sorry we're not in person, but this is the next best thing, and good to see all your faces on the screen this evening. And we are really delighted to welcome Jos Mole and Laura Chesham, Registrar and Deputy Registrar. They're going to be sharing all sorts of things with us this evening. We've already run this seminar once and it was brilliant, so we're looking forward to this one. It is being recorded, which means that if folk would like to have access to it afterwards, we can arrange that as well. And there will be an opportunity to ask some questions. Phil, are we going to do all the questions at the end, or?
We did last time. I think we had a pause at one point. I think, Laura, we'll leave it to you. If you feel, you know, it's an opportunity just to have a quick pause, take a breath and ask anything about the last section, we're happy to do that.
Brilliant. So do be thinking about any questions you might have. And we're aiming to be together for about an hour, and we're really looking forward to it. So welcome, Jos, and welcome, Laura. And Laura, I believe you're going to be starting for us.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to share some slides, which hopefully you can all see. Okay, so thank you everybody for joining us this evening, giving up part of your evening to join this session, which we hope you find useful. Jos and I are going to share the speaking, but together we're going to cover duties and responsibilities of Churchwardens under Church Law, your duties and responsibilities as charity trustees, as PCC members, looking at other charity trusteeships, safeguarding, just a brief look at some practical tips for you and your roles. And then we're going to look at a few specific topics, so marriage, and then looking at churchyards and the churchyard regulations, and then the faculty process. So Jos, I'm going to hand over to you.
Thank you, Laura. So we're starting off really looking at the some of the duties and responsibilities under Canon Law, really, of Churchwardens. Now, I suspect that many of you have been in post for many years and are very familiar with those duties, but it has been my experience that often people haven't kind of gone back to the source, as it were, of your duties and responsibilities, which is under Canon Law, and in particular Canon E1. Now, for those of you who've not sampled the canons in the past, I would encourage you to have a look at Canon E1. It's easily accessible online, so if you just type that into a search engine, you should be able to gain access to that via the Church of England website. And I think it's just helpful to see what legally your responsibilities are. But I'm just going to cover some of those now. So Canon E1 paragraph 4 states that Churchwardens are officers of the bishop, but it's in some respects that might be regarded as a bit of a misnomer, because actually the bishop can't remove a PCC member save in certain very specific circumstances, and it's really only the PCC that can do that. So in many respects, the role of the Churchwarden is really to represent the laity and to cooperate with the incumbent in fulfilling the mission of the church. And the canon refers in this regard to the concept of cooperation. But we would say that the reality of the situation is more along the lines of acting as a critical friend, as we would call it. Somebody who's loyal and supportive, and who establishes themselves as someone the incumbent can look to for advice and encouragement. So you're able to speak out when you need to and say, I've had feedback from the parishioners that they were unhappy with this, so don't be afraid of doing that. but on the other hand, give encouragement where possible. So it's a dynamic working relationship that you have. You should work with other clergy in the parish and the PCC to help it carry out its duties. And you should encourage that feedback from the parishioners that will enable you to support your clergy. You're required under Canon Law to use your best endeavours by example and precept to encourage parishioners in the practice of true religion and to promote unity and peace. I mean, this, in many respects, this is clearly quite old-fashioned language, but it does, it's open to interpretation, but I think it does cover things such as your requirement to ensure that people have a warm welcome when they attend church, and to make sure that the church is open as much as you reasonably are able to do so. You also have a responsibility in maintaining order and decency in the church and in the churchyard, and you do have the ability to remove individuals who cause a disturbance in the church. You also have you also hold title to the plate, the ornaments and other movable goods of the church, and you'll be aware that you're required to keep an inventory of all such items. So next slide, please. You will, in addition, be required to assist the PCC in discharging its duty to care, repair, ensure and maintain the fabric of the church. And this is something which is obviously reiterated at Archdeacon's visitation services when you make your declaration each year. In addition to that, you should inspect or arrange an inspection of the fabric of the church and all of the articles belonging to the church, which you're required to present to the APCM in each year. Furthermore, you are required, as I'm sure you'll be aware, to maintain a full terrier of all land belonging to the church. And as soon as practicable after the beginning of the year, the terrier, the inventory of movables, the church logbook should be presented to the PCC to assist them in discharging its functions. As I'm sure you're aware also, you play an important role in faculty proceedings, yeah, most churchwardens will be a party to such faculties that are looking at making improvements or to the church, repairs and indeed reorderings. Next slide, thank you. It's Canon F7 that requires seats to be provided in every church and chapel within the parish for the use by parishioners who attend divine service. And there are certain rules relating to that. You can direct individuals to certain places, and in fact you can turf people out of seats that have been allocated to others. I don't know whether in practice any of you have had any experience of that, but certainly there are such powers vested in churchwardens. Communion, it is your responsibility to provide sufficient wafers and wine for Holy Communion, and in relation to offerings and collections, again you're responsible for recording the amount received and for the proper use of the funds agreed together with the incumbent and the PCC. So these are the specific legal duties, but in reality you will all appreciate that in practice your responsibilities go way beyond that in terms of the administrative tasks that you undertake to support the church. But I thought it would be helpful for you to have that just a quick canter there through some of the basic legal requirements as covered by Canon Law. So Laura, over to you.
Yes, thanks, Joss. So when there's a vacancy in the benefice, together with the area dean and anyone else that the bishop appoints, the churchwardens have responsibility for maintaining the life, worship and mission of the benefice during the period of the vacancy. So in practice, that means from a legal perspective, having control of the parsonage. So essentially making sure that it's secure, and in practice, the Board of Finance has quite a large role to play in ensuring that the parsonage is kept in a suitable condition whilst there's nobody living in it, so that it's ready for the next person when the vacancy is filled. This also means ensuring that services continue in the parish, so also checking whether there are any sort of baptisms, weddings, funerals, and ensuring that there's sufficient clergy or lay ministers to cover those services, and in particular in the context of weddings, ensuring that where banns need to be called, that goes ahead. There's a requirement to maintain registers and files, and in particular if there's confidential information, which I expect there is some within the parish, then that's maintained securely. And then finally, just to mention that meetings should continue to go ahead as normal. So PCC meetings and the ACPM should all continue during the period of the vacancy. And as I said, you together with the area dean and anyone else appointed by the bishop will be responsible for ensuring they are called and held. So we're just going to look briefly at PCCs as charities and at Churchwardens' role as PCC members. So all PCCs are charities, and the Charity Commission is the regulator for all registered charities, so that but also any charities that aren't required to register that don't have another regulator for charity law purposes. So all PCCs are covered. Most don't have to register, and this requirement is in place until 2031. But if your PCC's income is over £100,000, then there will be a requirement to register with the Charity Commission. It's just important to note that even if you're not registered with the Charity Commission, you still have to comply with charity law and comply with the Charity Commission's guidance. The Charity Commission has taken a more robust approach to its role as regulator in recent years, and it does have several powers that it can use. So fairly low level powers. So for example, requesting information of charities, responding to questions, all the way through to opening what's called a statutory inquiry. And in some cases, the Charity Commission can appoint somebody to come in and take over from the trustees if they don't think the trustees are doing a good enough job. So there's quite a range of powers. So really important to make sure that the PCC is complying with charity law and the Charity Commission's guidance at all times. So churchwardens, by virtue of the church legislation, are ex officio members of the PCC and also the PCC Standing Committee. So basically, once you're admitted to the office of churchwarden, you automatically become a PCC member and therefore a charity trustee. This means that you have various duties and responsibilities under charity law, and I would really recommend having a look at the Charity Commission's guidance, publication CC3. The full name of that is on the slide, but it's a really accessible piece of guidance which summarises what a charity trustee is and what the key duties and responsibilities are in respect of that role. The other point to be mindful of before you appoint somebody new to be a churchwarden, so when we're coming around to the next year's election, if there's anyone new standing, just making sure that they are eligible to be a charity trustee, and in respect of you already being in office, just making sure that you continue to be eligible to be a charity trustee. And there are various situations in which you may not be able to, and again, these are covered in the Charity Commission's guidance. So charity trustees have the general management and control of the administration of the charity. That is essentially the legal definition of a charity trustee. And the main duty of any charity trustee is to act solely and exclusively in the best interests of the PCC, make sure it's solvent and well run, and it delivers charitable outcomes for the benefit of the public. So in doing so, the Charity Commission will require you to exercise such care and skill as is reasonable in the circumstances. And we are just going to look at some key areas. So objects and powers, the PCC's objects are effectively to advance the mission of the church within the parish, the whole mission of the church. And the powers of the PCC are set out in the Parochial Church Council's Powers Measure 1956 and also the Church Representation Rules. It's really important that in carrying out any activity, the PCC makes sure that it's exercising powers that it has and that those powers are being exercised to advance the charitable purposes. It's important that as PCC members, you don't benefit from your role. So this comes from the general concept that trustees act voluntarily. There are certain situations in law that trustees can benefit from their charity. But if you're not sure, so for example, if you might be entering into a contract and you have a personal interest in that, I would be making sure that that's recognised at the outset. And if you have any questions about whether or not the PCC can enter into a contract when a PCC member has that interest, then you should be asking questions of maybe the incumbent initially, and then maybe the area dean or the archdeacon, and we can obviously help at the registry too. So it's just being mindful of situations where benefits might arise. Conflicts of interest arises from the general duty that you're to act solely and exclusively in the best interests of the PCC, and therefore you should be mindful of any other interests or duties that you owe to other parties which might conflict with your ability to act solely and exclusively in the interests of the PCC. And the final area I just wanted to mention was acting personally and delegating. So it is okay for the PCC to delegate certain tasks to either particular individuals or to a committee, but just bear in mind that any decisions taken by the delegate are the responsibility of the PCC members still. So really important to make sure that where you are delegating, there's that reporting line, and it's really clear on the level of authority and the scope of the authority that you've given. By virtue of being a churchwarden, not only are you a PCC member, you might also be a trustee of another charity that's connected to the parish. So quite often we see other charities where the trustees are listed as the vicar and churchwardens or the rector and churchwardens. So again, this is you're being admitted to the church, to the office of churchwarden. You then automatically become a trustee of these other charities as well. Bearing in mind that you are a PCC member and you owe a duty to act solely and exclusively in the interests of the PCC, there is the potential for there to be a conflict between the duties you owe to the PCC and the duties you would owe as a trustee of these other charities. Quite often the interests are aligned, but it's just being aware that this is a possibility that it might happen and that you may need to manage any conflicts that arise appropriately. And knowledge and record keeping I've just put on the slide because sometimes in the registry we get queries about trusts which nobody has any information on, and I think it's really important if you come across something during your time as a churchwarden that you didn't have any information on before, really important to start keeping that record that you can pass on to your successors, because it makes their job much easier. So Joss, I think I'm passing back to you.
Yes, thank you, Laura. So just really wanted to say a few words about safeguarding and just to emphasize how important a subject this is. And I'm sure that the overwhelming majority of you will have embraced this and recognized just how important it is and also I think how damaging the neglect in this area has been to the church, and how we need to be really well thought out and really on the ball with regard to what we do now. Yeah, and it's important that we take this responsibility seriously, because I think one of the things I've seen as registrar is some people who can't see the relevance of safeguarding to them. They regard it as perhaps being in the nature of red tape. And it's interesting that this year, when doing my safeguarding training renewal with the National Safeguarding Team, there's a rather different approach that's been taken in that training, which is to see safeguarding as embodied in our whole theology. It's not just a box ticking exercise. It is something where if we take our faith seriously, we must take safeguarding seriously. So safeguarding has its current, but in its current form, has its background in the Safeguarding and Clergy Discipline Measure of 2016. Incidentally, for those of you who are not familiar with measures, it's important to stress that a measure is in fact, to all intents and purposes, an act of Parliament. So it has the full force of law. It's not just rules produced by the Church of England. Since January 2017, there has been this requirement for churchwardens to have due regard to guidance issued by the House of Bishops on matters relating to the safeguarding of children and vulnerable adults. So some of you, I'm sure, will be aware about what that means, but just to confirm, the due regard means that a person is under the duty is not free to disregard it, but is required to follow it unless there are cogent reasons for not doing so. And cogent for these purposes means clear, logical, and convincing. So the message generally is not just have due regard. It in practice means you need to follow it unless there are very exceptional circumstances why you should not do so. So this is a duty that is imposed on churchwardens as well as PCC members, and it confirms a number of policy commitments, such as promoting a safer environment and culture. It relates to safe recruitment, supporting those with any responsibility relating to children and vulnerable adults within the church, responding promptly to every safeguarding concern or allegation, caring pastorally for victims, survivors of abuse and other affected persons, caring pastorally for those who are the subject of concerns or allegations of abuse and other affected persons, and also responding to those that may pose a present risk to others. So many of you will, I think, be aware that there is the requirement that you produce a statement that you've complied with that requirement to have due regard to the guidance in your annual report. And some of you may be aware that failure to do that, certainly in the case of the incumbent, it's a very serious matter, and that could result in an allegation of misconduct being made against a member of clergy who has not fulfilled their duties in that regard. So for clergy, it's a very serious matter indeed. There are sanctions with regard to others who may find that they are reported to the Charity Commission. There are also consequences in terms of your insurance policy. You may be aware that the Ecclesiastical Insurance Group have said that their insurance cover is only valid where the House of Bishops safeguarding policy and practice guidance is being followed. So I'm sure you wouldn't want to be put in that position where, through not following the guidance, you've thereby avoided your insurance cover. So this is a developing matter, and we have in the pipeline the Safeguarding Code of Practice Measure 2021, which really is going to put the House of Bishops guidance on a statutory footing. So I think we can just see this developing further. So that, I think, is oh no, I was going to say a little bit more about this disqualification from acting as a churchwarden. So at the moment, it's more the sort of significant offences that are covered by this. So a churchwarden who's on the barred list will be disqualified, and there is a power that the bishop has, one of the limited powers of that a bishop has, to suspend a churchwarden. First of all, if they've been arrested on suspicion of committing an offence involving children or young persons, or if the bishop is satisfied on the basis of information provided the local authority that they constitute a significant risk of harm. There is a right of appeal against that, but this, I think, is a necessary protection for bishops to be able to act in those rather more extreme circumstances. But I do wonder whether the movement is such that we will see this extended so that the position with regard to churchwardens and PCC members will perhaps chime more with the seriousness of failing to abide by safeguarding regulations as applies currently to members of clergy. So Laura, back to you.
Thanks, Ross. So there's also a charity law perspective on safeguarding. So the Charity Commission in around 2017-2018 were required to look more seriously at what they were saying about a charity trustee's duties in respect of safeguarding. And you may have heard in the press about the Oxfam and Save the Children cases, which prompted this review by the Charity Commission. And that review sort of ended in the Commission releasing some guidance, which is called Protecting People and Safeguarding Responsibility, Protecting People from Harm, Charity Trustees' Duties. It's available online, and I suggest you have a look at it. It was actually updated last week, and that guidance specifically says that the Charity Commission considers that protecting people and safeguarding responsibilities should be a governance priority for all charities, and that as part of fulfilling your duties as charity trustees, then there is an expectation that trustees take reasonable steps to protect people from harm. And that, in your case, in the PCC's case, that's anybody at all that comes into contact with the PCC, so not necessarily any just direct beneficiaries. And if something goes wrong, then it's the charity trustees, so the PCC members and you as churchwardens, who are accountable for putting any issues right. The Charity Commission sees the charity trustees' duty as being a proactive duty, and there is a requirement for all charities to have a safeguarding policy. So you will, as Joss has just spoken about, there is a Church of England framework for safeguarding, and our view is that if you are fulfilling the Church of England's requirements, then you will also be satisfying the Charity Commission's requirements. But it's still important to make sure that you're aware of the charity law position on this. There is also a requirement to report serious incidents. This isn't a legal duty on charity trustees, but it is a responsibility. And again, the Charity Commission see this as part of charity trustees discharging their duties generally, and making sure that they are protecting the charity. And so a serious incident is, as I've put on the slide, an adverse event, whether actual or alleged, which results in or risks significant harm to the charity, its beneficiaries, staff, volunteers, or others who come into contact with the charity through its work, loss of money or assets, damage to property, or harm to work or reputation. So it's quite wide. And in around 2019, the House of Bishops issued some helpful guidance, which was put together in consultation with the Charity Commission. And it is specific guidance on reporting serious incidents for organisations within the Church of England. So there is specific guidance for PCCs, but also boards of finance and other religious communities. So there's a piece of guidance that's specifically for safeguarding related incidents and a separate piece of guidance which deals with non-safeguarding serious incidents. And both of these pieces of guidance are available online. There is a requirement to make reports promptly, and in practice that is as soon as possible after the incident occurs, or you become aware that it's a possibility, so there's a risk there, or as soon as possible after you become aware of it. So if, for example, a third party informs you, that it's promptly from the time you hear about it. So in terms of safeguarding incidents, the guidance makes clear that the reporting of those incidents should be delegated by each PCC to the diocesan safeguarding advisor. So the DSA will then make the report to the Charity Commission, and they will also update the National Safeguarding Team as well. In the context of reporting non-safeguarding serious incidents, you can delegate those as well to somebody else, but there isn't a requirement to in the same way as there is for safeguarding incidents. And if the PCC needs to make a report, a non-safeguarding report, then bear in mind that there is an online form for making that report, but there's further detail set out in the guidance if you do find yourself in a position where you think you may need to make a report. So I think before we move on to the specific topics, we just wanted to flag some practical tips, which are probably obvious, but asking questions, please do ask questions of people who are previously in post, of your incumbent, your archdeacon, your area dean, the registry. There's lots of people to ask questions. And there's also lots of resources online. So I've mentioned a few pieces of guidance, Charity Commission guidance, and also the House of Bishops guidance for serious incident reporting. The parish resources website is really, really useful. So that links through to the formal guidance, but also provides lots of other resources as well. The Charity Commission regularly issues alerts. They generally issue something each day, and it's quite easy to sign up online to those. I've spoken about record keeping, really, really useful both for you and also your successors. And then there's the final point to mention is, see on the slide, consider appointing a deputy. And in general, this will just be somebody who you ask to help share tasks with, and they won't have any legal duties, but there are some circumstances that are limited where they might do. So if you want to have a conversation, get a bit more detail about appointing somebody to help you, then it's probably worth a conversation initially with your incumbent, but maybe the archdeacons or your area dean as well. Archdeacon Phil, I think maybe now might be a good time to stop for questions.
Thank you very much, Laura and Josh, so far. If you've got a question, if you could just put your yellow hand up, if you know how to do that, it's under the reactions sign at the bottom, and then that will make sure I can see who's got their hand up, hopefully on my screen. Susan, if you unmute yourself first.
There we are.
There
Sorry,
we go.
It wasn't responding. Yes, there's something that's arisen from time to time about church collections for charities. So the PCC decides each year about whether the PCC will award some money to church-related charities. And I'm a trustee of another charity, which has nothing to do with the church. And I was uncomfortable when we were doing it in a way that it didn't strictly relate to our parish. And so what we do now is we hold two collections on such occasions, one for the charity, it might be Crisis at Christmas or something, and one for the church collection. And I wasn't quite sure really whether I was making too much fuss about nothing, but my other charity would never have used any of its funds for any other charity, if you see what I mean.
Thank you, Susan. I think that's fairly clear. Joss, do you want to say something about targeted giving?
Yes, I'm sure Laura may have something to say about this as well, but I think that one of the benefits of being involved with the Church of England is that it does have very broad missional objects. So if you are satisfied that this donation is going to support the mission of the church, then you can take a pretty broad view of that. And certainly I've been a PCC member in the past, and I'm aware of charitable donations that we've made, sometimes to international charities, as part of the specific mission of that PCC to help support such ministries. I think it is, of course, important to take account of any conflict of duty you may have in that situation. So if you are a trustee of a charity that you would like the church to support, then clearly you're potentially in a conflict situation and would need to withdraw from any discussions regarding that. But I think it's very much a matter, I think, this for the church as to whether it's satisfied that this is promoting its mission. Laura, do you want to add anything to that?
Thank you. Maybe just a couple of brief things, one of which is probably obvious, and that is if you are asking people to donate with the intention of passing on to a particular charity, then obviously all of the money that's given for that collection must go to the charity that you've said it will. And the other point really is one of due diligence, I suppose. So the Charity Commission has guidance on grant making, and also you may find yourself in a position where the collection is actually for an organisation which maybe isn't a charity, or it's an overseas charity, in which case I would recommend that the PCC, if it doesn't know the organisation particularly well, does some due diligence on it to make sure that it is appropriate for the PCC to be giving money to it, because ultimately you want to make sure that you're giving the money for charitable aims, and there is a sort of reputational issue potentially associated with that. You don't want to end up in a situation where the money goes to an organisation which ends up with negative press in the media, and the PCC somehow ends up associated with that. So yeah, just making sure that you're doing checks before you're encouraging people to give for a particular cause.
Thank you both very much. The next question, it says Sue Bartlett, but you don't look like Sue Bartlett.
It's Derek Bartlett.
Derek.
Yeah, it's just a quick one. We recently had a new statement on safeguarding. It says the parish. I'm assuming it means the parochial parish, because we can keep an eye on the parish, but the actual parish, we can't really control what goes on in the parish unless somebody tells us. And it's just a bit worrying that we're going to sign this document, to say this is our statement of safeguarding, but it actually is telling us we've got to look after the parish as well as the parochial parish. That's our little problem that one or two people have spotted, that's all.
Thanks, Derek. So a little bit of ambiguity over the wording there. Joss or Laura, do you want to?
I'm sure it means the parochial parish. I can't see that it relates in any way to the civic parish. So that's how I would take it. But I'm not. I think we'd need to see exactly what that statement says to be able to advise on it properly. Yeah. It's difficult doing it out of context, really.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you, Derek. Brian, and then we'll do Angie, and then we'll move on. Brian?
Yeah, just a simple question. Is it possible to get a copy of this presentation so I can share it with PCC members?
Yeah, yes, you will be able to get a copy. Our PAs, the Churchwardens PAs, will let you know where that is, and we are recording it, so you can also have a copy of the recording as well.
Lovely, thanks.
Thank you. Angie?
Can you hear me? So,
yes,
we're two fairly new Churchwardens, although I have been it for a year, but I'm still feel very new. We haven't yet had sight of logbook or inventory because those went missing. We think we're going to see them soon, but we have a situation where somebody has brought out an old Bible, a Breacher's Bible, which we are going to take to BCC with a view to actually selling. It was something that was given to the church, I don't know, 20 odd years ago. Are we allowed to sell things that have been given to the church that are in the inventory?
Registrar can tell you the answer to that.
Yes, well, I will be touching on this later. It's important that any items really of any significant value, well, indeed, potentially items that have little value, but may be of historical or other interest, will require a faculty if you're going to dispose of it. And indeed, that it might be that this thing is actually has significant value and might be regarded as what we call a church treasure. I think at this point, I was going to come on to this later, but as you've raised the point, it perhaps would be an appropriate place to mention this now, which is the famous or infamous case of Emmanuel, Cheltenham, which some of you may have heard about, where the church PCC sold a painting by an artist called Franz Hittenbach. And at one level, it was a great success story because they got £20,000 for this painting, which was not a greatly loved painting, it has to be said, so far as the church was concerned. The problem is that they didn't get a faculty for it. Therefore, the person who purchased it at auction did not get title to that painting. And it resulted in a consistory court hearing to determine whether retrospective authorization should be given or confirmatory faculty should be granted for this. And it was in fact opposed by the Church Buildings Council. So it created all kinds of problems, and it also got into it was reported in the Church Times, and where just as a warning to you all, this is our previous Chancellor, who's now retired, described the Churchwardens in that case as having been very, very stupid, I quote. So please do take that on board. It's really important that disposing of anything really in the church, you've got to ask yourself, is this something that requires a faculty? So, certain things, worn out booklets or whatever, you've got to take a common sense view as to whether it's just junk. But if you're in any doubt whatsoever, talk to the area dean or archdeacon about it, or ask the registry, do I need a faculty for this, or am I free to dispose of it? So Josh,
that's on a case-by-case basis, really. There isn't a de minimis.
There isn't a de minimis. As I said on the last occasion that we gave this presentation, that there was a rather amusing letter in the Church Times from somebody who said, after having read the judgment, he felt that he was in some degree of trepidation every time he went to empty the vestry waste paper basket. We don't want clearly people to go that far, but it's a simple phone call, I think, to establish is it a matter that might need a faculty, and as I say, it is a difficult judgment call, because things that appear like rubbish may actually have significant value, particularly in churches where you have things that may unexpectedly have very significant value. And if they don't have great monetary value, they may be of great historic or architectural significance. So take advice is the
thank you, Josh. And you take advice, and it might be worth getting evaluation as well at the same time. So, thank you. Great. Will there be another opportunity for questions? But should we go back to Joss and to Laura?
Thank you. So we're going to talk about marriage now briefly. It's a bit of a canter through, I'm afraid. So hopefully what I'm about to say does make sense. If you have any questions, please let me know. So at the moment, there are various ways in which a couple can get married in church, and we split those into what we refer to as ecclesiastical preliminaries and civil preliminaries. So the ecclesiastical preliminaries are banns, common license, and Archbishop special license. And the civil preliminaries are now a marriage schedule, which sounds fairly odd now, but they were previously known as superintendent registrar's certificates, or SRCs. So if you've heard of that before, then this is the same thing, the marriage schedule. So with ecclesiastical preliminaries, most couples that want to get married in church will probably have their banns read. There are some exceptions to that. So for example, timing, banns need to be called on 3 Sundays before the date of the wedding. So if there isn't enough time, then the couple can't have their banns read. And the other common situation is where one or both of the couple live outside of England and Wales. Those couples can't have their banns read either. So in those cases, the next port of call is generally the common license, and that replaces banns and can be granted a maximum of 3 months before the date of the wedding. So there is a legal process to go through for that, which involves one of the couple swearing an oath, which is essentially to confirm that there is no legal reason why the couple cannot marry one another. And Joss and I are able to administer those oaths, but there are also various other surrogates in the diocese dotted around, including the archdeacons, who were fantastic during the lockdown because we did lots of common licenses. And we've got a bit of a spread geographically, so we think that that helps when it comes to applications. And then the other ecclesiastical preliminary, which is not particularly common, but does sometimes arise, and that's the Archbishop's special license. So if, for example, a couple wanted to get married at home because one of them was very ill, then they would need to apply for an Archbishop's special license in that case. But also situations where a couple has a connection to a particular church, but that connection is not what we would call a legal qualifying connection, which is the type of connection you need to have your banns read or to obtain a common license. So for that, we mean living in the parish, baptized, parents were married in the parish, that sort of connection. And civil preliminaries, generally, we're looking at couples here who are not British or Irish, or have what is being referred to as pre-settled or settled status, and that status is in the context of the EU settlement scheme, which is as a result of Brexit. So individuals had to apply to sign up to this scheme before the 30th of June this year. It is possible still to apply, but very few people probably will now because of the conditions to that. So where a couple is granted pre-settled or settled status, they can still marry in church using ecclesiastical preliminaries. So the key thing is, if you have a couple coming to your church applying to get married there, is to check their nationality, which is something that should be happening anyway, and asking them for proof of their status. So where you've got somebody that's telling you they've got pre-settled or settled status, then the way that they go around proving that is by giving you access to the government's website. You effectively get given a code and you log in and you can access the details for the individual, and it confirms their status. So once you're satisfied of that, then you're okay, provided all the other conditions are satisfied, to go ahead and marry the couple with banns or common license. Anybody who isn't British or Irish or have pre-settled or settled status can get married in church, but they need to get a marriage schedule, and the marriage schedule is issued by the civil registrar rather than through the diocese. Hopefully that makes some sense. So the other change that's happened this year is in relation to the registration of marriages that happen in church. So prior to May this year, you will be aware that couples get married in church, they sign the register book, they get a certificate from the officiating minister at the service, and then the vicar will have the responsibility to fill in a quarterly return, and that's the way that the civil registrar, who is responsible for registering marriages no matter where they take place, that's how the civil registrar will find out about all the marriages that take place in church. Post May this year, that's all changed, and the whole registration process is now dealt with by the civil registrar. So churches no longer have marriage register books, or they shouldn't. They should have been sent back to the civil registrar. And instead, what will happen is that for each marriage where there have been ecclesiastical preliminaries, so the couple got married following banns, common license, or Archbishop special license, there'll be a marriage document. And the marriage document is in a standard form. It looks very much like the page in the marriage registers that you used to have in church. And that is the document that is signed by the couple, the witnesses, and the officiating minister during the service. Where the marriage schedule is the preliminary to the marriage, so the couple have had civil preliminaries, then the marriage schedule is signed by the couple, the witnesses, and the officiating minister, the same way as the marriage document. Whether you have a marriage document or a marriage schedule, that piece of paper, to avoid using the word document, then needs to be sent to the civil registrar. The actual legislation refers to the marriage document or marriage schedule being sent to your local register office. But the local registration service for Gloucestershire has confirmed that for marriages within the diocese, all marriage documents or marriage schedules need to be sent to the Cheltenham office, and they should be sent by post. We have dealt with some inquiries at the registry where churches have been a bit concerned about putting the original signed document into the post. And I suppose practically we would recommend sending it by some sort of recorded post, so you've got a way of tracking it in case you're concerned that it's gone missing. The civil registrar has come out and said, do not take copies of your signed marriage document or marriage schedule. But I think provided if you are going to take a copy, mark it copy for internal use only. So you've got that if you want it, but bear in mind that if the original marriage document or marriage schedule does go missing, you will be required to, or the officiating minister will be required to effectively create a new original. So even if you do take a copy of it, that wouldn't be acceptable to register the marriage. So once the civil registrar has the marriage document or marriage schedule, they'll input all the details onto a new centralised register, and the couple can then apply and pay for their marriage certificate. And as I said, the marriage registers are no longer held by the churches, but instead each church where marriages can be solemnised has to hold a register of marriage services. So this is a much more basic book with sort of basic details of the service and the parties. But that is a requirement for each church to hold one. And I think that's all I was going to say. Over to you, Joss. Thank you, Laura.
So we wanted to say a bit about the churchyards and the diocesan churchyard regulations. And the archdeacons will confirm that we often converse on such matters. It is a significant area of pastoral upset, shall we say. So what we like to do is to try and keep that to a minimum, and part of this is actually being aware of where things can go wrong. So I thought I'd just say a little bit about this. And first of all, the nature of the regulations. These are the Chancellor's regulations. So the Chancellor is effectively the legal judge of the diocese, and the starting point is that you can't really do anything in a churchyard without his say-so. But that's subject to the authorization that he delegates. He delegates certain matters to incumbents, to priests in charge, to the ministers under those regulations. So where you have permission under those regulations to do something, then the incumbent is duly authorized to do that. I should say, by the way, my apologies to those who are involved in the church that doesn't have a churchyard, but I think it's nonetheless it's good for all to be aware of this. And I'm also conscious of the fact that whilst we're talking about this being principally an incumbent's responsibility, I'm also aware that churchwardens very often do get involved in such matters. So, so the point is that the regulations are not simply a list of things you can't do. They're actually a list of things you can do. So if they're not in the regulations, you can't say, oh, they're not covered by the regulations, we can do it. It's actually the reverse. If it's not covered by the regulations, you can't do it. And therefore, in the normal way, you'd need to the person who wants to do whatever it is that's proposed ought to be applying for a faculty. We do have circumstances, however, where there are minor departures from the churchyard regulations that are proposed, and in those circumstances it is possible for, usually the way it operates is I speak to the Chancellor about the matter, and he is able to extend the delegated authority of the incumbent under the regulations to approve a particular matter on a one-off basis. So, as I say, this is really for matters that are of a minor nature. They're not for big matters which will require a faculty. So it's helpful to bear in mind that that might be possible, and it's helpful also because it saves people from having to pay a faculty fee for something that really isn't that significant. It's important that the regulations are publicised as widely as possible. We've had complaints by people who've said, after having buried somebody in a grave, and that when it comes to applying for a particular headstone, they then find that they cannot have the stone that they had always wanted. And in part they said, well, when we applied, we never knew that these regulations applied. And so I would suggest that it's really important to bring these regulations to everyone's attention. So if you've got a parish website, perhaps public have a link to them there, because they're on the Diocesan, readily available from the Diocesan website. Have a printed off copy which you keep in the inside the church and perhaps in the churchyard. Do as much as you can to promote them, so as to minimise the number of excuses that people might have otherwise for not being aware of them. Also, just be aware of further burials in existing graves. Now, in open churchyards, this is not normally a problem, and we would encourage people to make good use of space. So often where there's been a coffin burial, we'd say family member ought to be able to be buried in the same grave. But it's vital that you consult widely with everyone, because we've had cases of people being buried in graves where there's been a family feud which has not been disclosed, and really it can cause pastoral meltdown in those situations. So I highlight that importance of consulting all family members to make sure that this isn't going to cause any upset. You'd be surprised at how often that occurs. So Laura, if you could turn to the next slide, thank you. So also some of you may well have closed churchyards. I think it's important to understand that this covers two different situations. One is where simply the churchyard is full and there can't be any further burials as a result. But a churchyard is not properly closed unless it's closed by order in council, which is essentially the Privy Council who will do this. And once a churchyard has been closed in that way, then the general rule is there can be no further burials. There may, excuse me, there may be, under the terms of the order in council, certain exceptions. So they will allow, for example, they may authorize the burial of further coffins where it's, say, a family grave or something of that nature. They may also authorize the interment of cremated remains in family graves. But it's important that you ascertain, if your churchyard is closed, that you have a right to either bury further bodies, which is pretty limited, or to inter cremated remains. Now, I should say that even if the order in council doesn't make provision for that, you can apply to have a garden of remembrance set aside for the purpose of further interments of cremated remains, even though the churchyard has been closed. I suspect that a number of you will already have that in place, but that does need to be approved by faculty. Likewise, you can actually apply for individual sets of cremated remains to be buried in existing graves, even where that's not authorised by the terms of the order in council. It's a complicated area, so again, if in doubt, speak to your area dean and or archdeacon. Just a brief word on liability for maintenance. I'm sure, again, a number of you will be aware that you have this ability to pass over responsibility for maintaining the churchyard to your local authority. That may be the parish council, town council, and or the wider local authority. But it has been very common for me to hear complaints about how poorly churchyards have been maintained by those local authorities. So if you are thinking about passing over that responsibility, think carefully about whether that's something you really want to do, because you don't necessarily get the the best job done. A very brief word about grave space reservations and PCC policies. A number of PCCs have basically said, well, we don't like people applying for faculties for grave spaces, and we've had these can be quite controversial. So what we would say is it's fine for a PCC policy to say we're not going to, you know, we will object to anyone who applies in circumstances where there are, for example, less than 5 years plots available. So where time is running out and people effectively, by applying for a reservation, going to jump the gun, then I think it's fine for the PCC policy to provide for that. But I think where people have got into difficulties is where PCCs have simply not liked the idea of a grave space reservation and had a blanket ban on all of them. You can't override the discretion of the Chancellor in this area, who may override it and say, actually, there are good reasons why this person should actually be granted a reservation. Again, something to discuss with the area dean or archdeacon if in any doubt. I don't really want to say anything more about exhumations, other than to say we have had a number of cases where people have inadvertently been buried in the wrong place, and exhumations, as you can imagine, particularly if it's a coffin burial, are extremely embarrassing if you find that somebody has had to have their remains exhumed and then buried somewhere else. I've already covered burials in what we call a full churchyard, and that will very much depend upon the terms of the Ordering Council. And then finally, just a few words about the faculty process. Now, I'm sure many of you will have had your names applied to faculty documents. I've already mentioned the Emmanuel Cheltenham case, so I won't say anything further about that, other than to repeat that this is your get out of jail free card. If you're in any doubt as to whether the matter requires a faculty, then please ask. I've also highlighted there the importance of consultation and engagement, not just with your with those who with your congregation, those who attend the church, but with the wider parish as well. And because, you know, it is a parish church, and therefore just because people are not regular attenders don't necessarily mean that they're not going to be interested in what's going on there. And we do find that the applications that tend to have the smoothest passage, particularly where they are potentially controversial, is where there has been a long process of engagement and consultation and listening to people and making people feel that they have been listened to and heard. I thought helpful to mention how the Chancellor will determine a case, particularly in, say, a major reordering. The leading case is that of St Alkmund Duffield, and this sets out the tests that a Chancellor will apply when considering a faculty application. And this basically is to say, will the faculty proposal cause any harm to the fabric of the church? And inevitably, faculty applications will cause some degree of harm. And then they have to look at the significance of that harm. How extensive is it? But also that's got to be looked at in the context of the historical and architectural significance of the church. And the greater, you know, if you're talking about a grade 1 listed church, then the level of harm is likely to be that much greater than if it's unlisted. And what the Chancellor then has to do is to apply a balancing exercise, and he or she will have to say, does the good that comes from implementing these proposals outweigh the damage that would otherwise be caused by allowing these the reordering or other faculty application to go ahead? And it's that balancing exercise. So this highlights the importance of getting your missional case properly stated in your faculty application, the more you can say about why this proposal is going to benefit the mission of your church, the more that will be persuasive for the Chancellor in terms of saying, I feel I ought to grant a faculty. And clearly that bar gets higher the more architecturally and historically significant the item is that you're looking to change. So I think that's all that we were going to say. So I think we're now past 7 o'clock, but Archdeacons, I don't know whether you feel we have time for any questions, but I'm sure we'd be happy to answer those if anyone has any.
Thank you, Josh. Yes, we're past 8 o'clock even. So I think what we'll do is we'll go on till about 8:15. So we've got about 10 minutes. So again, if you could raise a hand, that would be much appreciated. Really appreciate your input, Josh and Laura. Thank you so much. Alan, you've got a question. If you can unmute yourself.
Yes, thank you. It's re-parish council and closed churchyards. Is there a written or legal document whereby safeguarding in particular I'm worried about, with large trees with disease, boundary walls, and in particular gravestones, safety. And I've had a run-in with the parish council at the moment with these items. Is there anything written where they would have signed an obligation to these things?
Yeah, no, there's nothing. It's quite a grey area as to what the what responsibilities the parish council will have, and it'll vary. But I would suggest that in this case, this may be a case where perhaps we ought to have an offline discussion about this, just to see what what is covered and what not. So for example, there may be arguments over the paths as to whether they have responsibility for that. But yeah, and there are some who, I mean, to my mind, the whole area of churchyard, gravestone safety is another whole can of worms, really. So without trying to avoid the question, it is complicated. There's nothing. There is a little bit of case law on this, but it's not clear cut. So as I say, best to have an offline discussion.
Okay, so it's a bit of a case by case basis, but thanks for raising that, Alan. Robert.
I've been a church warden for a couple of years, but I'm just trying to do a faculty, and it's only for a very small plaque in the church. And your forms are so complicated and totally irrelevant to a lot of the things that are affected by this plaque. It's being very, very difficult to achieve anything. I've had to submit photos and plans and everything, and it's not, it doesn't appear difficult to me, but it does to you by the looks of things.
Yeah, well, unfortunately there is it is one form, but I think in those kind of circumstances there's a lot that you can just write not applicable to. And the other thing I would say is really to give credit to our excellent DAC team at Church House. You can always call them if you're in any doubt as to what to do in filling in that form, and they, I'm sure, would be very willing to help you out, and anyone else who've got any queries on them.
Yeah, I've had quite a lot of help from them, but I think Carmen's just left, so I don't know what's happened to my form now. But
we've got a new administrator. Thank you, though, Robert. We will take that on board and have a look at them. Obviously, our faculties are hugely varied, and so sometimes it might seem a little bit of overkill for one thing, but we can't create a form for everything. I think it gives me an opportunity to say thank you to you as church wardens for the way in which you have embraced the online faculty system, which certainly makes our job as archdeacons much, much easier, and the DAC as well. So thank you for that. Thank you. Derek, I'll come back to you because you've already asked a question. So John Ford, next, please.
Just trying to unmute myself. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Jolly good. John Ford, I'm Preston Parish, right on the western boundary of the diocese. Are we at a stage where we should consider some form of liability notice to be affixed to our front gates, saying that anyone enters here does so at their own risk? Because I'm particularly conscious of the aging pathways that we've got on our churchyard. And whilst we aim to try and keep them as safe as possible, they do crack up, and they could cause somebody injury, if they tripped over or something like that. So what do you think we should be doing?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that as a matter of law, you can't exclude liability for death or personal injury arising excuse me, from your own negligence. Well, I don't mean your negligence, but the PCC has been negligent. So it's a tricky area. You do need to really make sure, first and foremost, that your insurance cover is in place and is adequate for your needs. You also do need to assess the condition of, if it's a path, you need to be thinking about that, and if necessary, making it a priority. Again, plenty of people you can talk to about that, and Ecclesiastical, if they're your insurers, I'm sure would be willing to help. It may be a case, we've had this with some tabletop tombs, for example, with some rather dangerous looking spiked fencing around them, where people have been worried about people causing themselves a personal injury. But you can put up appropriate warning signs and things like that. Dangerous areas can, of course, be fenced off. But it's a tricky thing. You can only really do your best in those situations. But at the end of the day, you will need to have that insurance in place as your backstop, really. I don't know if the Archdeacon's got anything they want to add.
I think, John, if you've got something particular in mind, it's worth getting your insurance company to come and have a look with you and give you their advice on what they will cover and what they would suggest.
Okay, thank you very much for that.
Thank you. Derek, we'll go back to you.
Yeah, just a quick one on faculties. I have found that the DAC have been very helpful. When you sort of get stuck in a black hole, they do help you out. All I wanted was, has anybody got any tips on overdressed graves? We have got a real problem at Portley. So we just need, anybody got any tips on how to overcome it gently?
Well, can I say at the outset is that there is the ability under the regulations to remove certain items. So that's the starting point.
That unfortunately that happened, and we've had threats, broken legs, and all sorts if they ever find out who did it. So, well,
in that case, if you've had that sort of treatment, it's worth raising it with the registry, and we can raise it with the Chancellor, who will take that sort of behaviour full on, I think, and give it
difficult question, Derek, but thanks for raising. My first port of call would always be the Archdeacon of Gloucester.
Well, we'll start with Kat first, our incumbent, and work our way up with her.
Very, very happy to have a conversation, Derek, at any time.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Hugh.
I was going to.
Sorry, Hugh, sorry, Susan. Can I bring Hugh in, and then we'll come to.
I've forgotten my name.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, right. It's about church logbooks. A lady said they couldn't find hers. I've got the opposite. I've got this very nice 25-year worth of logbook, but my predecessors have filled it with stuff under 10 years. And I'd like some guidance on what's supposed to be recorded. Just thinking aloud, if you do something to a Norman arch and with a faculty, yes, that ought to be recorded for posterity. When you change the plug on the tier, do you really need to keep the estimate, the receipt, the electrician's certificate, and all the rest of it? It's just full of stuff. Every time somebody cleans the gutters, it's got put in there. And these sheets of paper where you fill in all the expenditures of the year, well and truly filled up. So is there guidance, or can we have some guidance on the diocesan website about what needs to go in these logbooks?
Josh, have you got a?
I'm afraid I don't have a view on it, other than to say I would try and take a common sense approach. And I think certain things which you perhaps would regard as de minimis and really are not going to be terribly helpful, even if recorded in the logbook, maybe that is overkill. But I think probably it's better to be thorough. I would err on that side, but not over the top. Put it that way. That's just my practical sense of what people ought to be doing.
Thank you. We're running out of time, so what we'll do is just take a brief question from the three that have got their hands up, and then we'll call it a day. So that's Susan first, and then I know I'm really sorry, I can't remember your name. I do know you. It's
Sorry.
Yes,
did you want me to start now?
Susan, yes, Susan,
it was just very briefly what we're planning to do about overkill on graves is publicise what we want for as regulations which the PCC have agreed, which matches the Church of England guidance. There's nothing that conflicts there. And then just keep publicising that, and then have conversations with the particular family or two, if we can catch them when they're there, and discuss with them how they might adjust what they're doing.
That's really helpful, Susan. I think that, just to reiterate Joss's point about communicate. The more you can communicate in advance, the less problems you'll have. The other person, I don't think Joss mentioned it, but making sure stonemasons are aware of the regulations is really important. They often plead ignorance and say, well, they were working to Worcester's guidelines or something like that. Thank you. Next question.
Sorry, it's William Neal from Broadlawn.
Of course it is William, yes.
We are fast running out of space in our churchyard for further burials, but higher up back in the churchyard, clearly where there have, I would think, been burials many centuries ago, can we go back there? And what is the rules and regulations about burying where we fear there have been already burials, but many years ago?
Okay, well, it's a very good question. In theory, you can actually have further coffin burials. As long as the churchyard's not closed, you can reopen up those areas. Not a lot of people do it. There is a requirement that you ought to have had, certainly the absolute minimum is 50 years, but preferably 75 to 100 years ought to have gone before you can do any further coffin burials. We have been talking in the past about having a diocesan policy about this. And I certainly think it is good use of space. I mean, there are places that haven't been used for burials since medieval times. Yes, you may uncover skeletal remains in the process, but it's perfectly legitimate then to sort of bundle those up and drop them further down in the grave, the new grave that's being dug. So it is possible. So yeah, so that is a way forward. And if that's something of interest, we can talk about that further. In terms of cremated remains, however, those areas will quite often be used for a garden of remembrance, bearing in mind that you're not digging down very deep in those areas. And so, yes, the creation of a garden of remembrance in that area can extend the life of your churchyard quite considerably, but it doesn't obviously help out with the burial situation.
Thank you, William. And yes, Joss, we have talked about that before. Some dioceses have much clearer policies, you say, and it might be something that we could have a conversation with the new Chancellor about in due course. So thank you. John, last question.
Yes, thanks very much for a very interesting evening. Some quite important topics have been covered, such as safeguarding, and the comment that kept coming forward was, yeah, this document or this guidance has been updated and you ought to have a look at it. How do we actually find out what the new documents are and the documents that are relevant in terms of things that are really important to us that we should be looking at? I mean, clearly, we gain experience by talking to different members of the church and different churches. But, you know, for instance, safeguarding measure 2016, you know, and that's going to be, there's also an insurance cover measure 2021. How do we find out about it? You know, why would I have known that the insurance cover measure 2021 is something that I ought to be picking up and having a quick look at? Because you know, we spend a lot of time looking after the church. It's very important to each of us, and we do want to do the right thing. But to come out with a statement, oh, you ought to have a quick look at this, where, you know, how do you expect this to be updated with? What are the important measures or guidance that you would like us to come up to speed with?
Good question. Thank you. I think that one of the things we have been doing, albeit that we hold our hands up and say it's long overdue, is provide these update newsletters to PCC members that will provide further information on topics that are of current interest. So that is something we have in the pipeline, and we do aim to keep you up to date with that.
Right, well, that'll be very useful. That's all that needs to be said.
It just covers a number of topics. It's not going to be comprehensive. Safeguarding, the best place to go to, Church of England website. You type into Google Church of England safeguarding,
and I have done.
The resources are all there. So I would suggest that everything you need to know as a church warden is on the Church of England website.
Yes,
so, but it is that it's the unknown unknowns. If you don't know about it, where do you go to for that? But we'll certainly try and do our best to draw these things.
I'm sure. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. Thank you for that question. I think I would just add that, and generally, we do try to make sure, for example, a lot of the up-to-date legislation on safeguarding should be covered in the latest parish safeguarding handbook that you will be adopting. So we will make sure that's
great.
Thank you, everyone, for your questions. If there are more, the archdeacons are always happy to have a conversation with you. We have generally in past years, we've always had autumn church wardens workshops, which is a lovely opportunity to get together, and we will try and get those going again when we can meet more freely in person next year. But they're a great opportunity to update. Joss and Laura, again, thank you so much for your wisdom and your time. We appreciate it enormously. We are hugely, I think, grateful to you, and we're also in a great sense of privilege in this diocese to have such accessible registrar and deputy registrar. It's a huge privilege, and we're very grateful. Hilary, do you want to say anything before we close?
No, just echo your thanks, and a huge thanks to everyone for giving up their time this evening, and so to see your faces.
Yeah. And thank you for all that you do as church wardens. We're very aware that you often do an enormous amount behind the scenes that sometimes isn't seen or always appreciated, but we appreciate it enormously. I'd like just to finish with a prayer, if I may. It's a prayer that we used at the visitation services. So, of course, you'll all remember it, but let's just pray together. Living God, your love has sustained us. Your wisdom has guided us. We thank you for the joy and encouragement you give. Fill us, your servants, with your spirit, that we may daily listen to your voice and grow in understanding of your word, faithfully making known your salvation. Renew our churches, parishes and deaneries in unity and mission, that all who love you may work for the coming of your kingdom and see your glory revealed among us, in the power of Jesus Christ our Lord, in whose name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you very much, everybody. God bless you. And our PAs will let you have details, a copy of the slides and of the recording if you would like it. Thank you. Good night.
Good night.
Thank you. Good night. Good night.